Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Coffee with a Codex. My name is Nicholas Herman. I'm the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator here at the Schoenberg Institute, and I am filling in for my colleague Doc Porter, who is the regular presenter for Coffee with a Codex, although occasionally with special guests. So today I'm very pleased to show you a Missal. This is a relatively recent acquisition by Penn Libraries. It's MS Codex 2053. And it's right from the beginning, we can see with the binding that it's been well used and well loved. It's a book that is kind of interesting precisely because of its patterns of wear and tear. And this is a frequent feature of books in our collection at Penn. But of course, the use is what makes it interesting. And the wear and tear, particularly on the binding, allows us to see certain features of the construction of the book and also its later repair that are quite interesting. So we'll start by looking at the binding, and then we'll delve a little bit more into the contents of the book. So this binding appears to be original, though, as I said, repaired one or more times. One of the things that generally tells us this, at least an early binding and perhaps original, is the fact that it's flush with the text block, right? So you can see there's no reveal. That's called a reveal in a little lip or overhang of the boards is called a square or squares in bookbinding terminology. And this book doesn't have that. And that often indicates an earlier binding. And to the 16th century and later, we start to get bindings with a kind of significant overhang. And that sometimes relates to how the books were stored. If they were stored vertically, you'd want to have more of an overhang to prevent the text block from getting worn and damaged. But in a period when books were stored flat or in bags or carried around, like this book probably was, you often get that flush binding. So as I said, this is a missal. This is a book that contains all of the texts necessary for the celebration of the Mass in Christian liturgy throughout the year. And these were often, although not always, fairly compact volumes. This is something, a genre of book that really developed in the later Middle Ages and became much more common in the later Middle Ages, essentially because there was a proliferation of altars, because altars started to be endowed in churches for the saying of masses. And often these were commemorative masses, not necessarily even performed with anyone in the audience or anyone attending, just the priest occasionally. And so these books proliferated, these missals, because they were necessary for the celebration of Mass. And this missal is from northern Italy, around 1400, although it's a little bit difficult to date precisely. So I believe we've sort of given it the date of 1375 to 1425. And it has a later alteration, which is interesting, which I'll show you in a few minutes. But effectively, this is an example of a missal that is portable, that has been carried around a great deal. And the Mass itself changed a little bit in the 16th century with the Counter-Reformation, but not so much that a missal became outdated in Catholic Europe. Of course, there were great changes because of the Protestant Reformation in other parts of Europe, which meant that missals were often discarded or heavily modified later on. This one is fairly intact. It's complete despite the damage on the exterior, and we'll look at that. But what you can see from the binding, so it's so worn that the 3 binding cords, these are tawed leather tongs that hold the quires, hold the book block to the covers that are wood, and they are channeled through the wood. That's typical of medieval book binding, but here you can really see them, and you can sort of see, based on the wear on these raised bands here, this is a leather covering that would have been continuous. It's worn through on the sides, but you can see that these are split leather tongs. So the sewing of the quires is done around the 2 portions of the split, which just creates more adhesion and makes for a stronger binding. So that's quite a normal binding procedure for a 15th century book. The other feature you can see pretty clearly are the end bands, right? So the end bands are these additional an additional leather sort of strap here, and this one's a bit damaged. This one you can see it comes in diagonally and then across the head and the tail of the book, and that's sewn in as well. This is with a kettle stitch, which is a kind of stitch up here and at the bottom that reinforces the book structure. And you can see that that has some additional, possibly later, kind of a rougher sort of like twill fabric that has been attached, and there's some metallic strings here. I don't know if you can quite see those. They're quite frayed, but they're metallic threads, and this has all been tacked on with sort of star-shaped star-headed nails, which is quite interesting, which also appear here, which held in the straps. These might have been done later on. And you can see this one remnant of a strap, which would have attached to a clasp. This one is totally missing. And you also see on this side damage here, probably from a candle. This looks like a flame damage. And then bosses, so metal elements, were once attached at the 4 corners and in the center. And actually, if we carefully turn the book around, we see that there's one single boss remaining in the center of the lower board. And we can also see a little bit of tooling. I wonder if you can see that. This very thin red leather that has been applied over the boards. And you can see, not sure if you can see, but there is very shallow tooling. I'm trying to get it to catch the light. Maybe you can just see it there. Blind tooling of a sort of X pattern. And it's a 3 lines to form this frame, and then the kind of X pattern through the middle, a sort of very standard, not particularly luxurious kind of tooling. And I see that there's some comments in the chat, and thank you to my colleague Amy for answering some of those. So this book, this Missal, MS Codex 2053, it makes a very interesting contrast with MS Codex 2076, which is another Missal that I think was featured not too long ago on Coffee with a Codex with Dot. That's a much larger, much more formal Missal from approximately the same time, but in much better condition, and something that would have been used in an institution as opposed to by a traveling cleric. So let's open the book. We can see these are paper. This is a paper paste down and flyleaf. This is one sheet, probably a little bit later, maybe from the 16th century when some of these repairs may have been made. And someone has written Missale multae antiquitatis, so very old Missal. This is probably later when this had become a sort of curiosity due to its age. And we can sort of see here and here, this is just the leather end band that has that's been brought in here diagonally, and it's sort of stained. It's raised up and it's stained the paper a little bit. So this is the actual beginning of the text block, and as I mentioned, it's complete. It's a stand. So these missals are there can be a lot of variation, but there's a basic sort of standard order in which the texts occur, and this adheres to that standard order. And so basically, a missal is composed of sort of two main sections that that occur chronologically. So they cover the church year, the liturgical year, and there's sort of two interlocking systems. The first one is called the temporale, the proper of time. And so this is, these are all the readings for Mass throughout the year, starting with the first Sunday in Advent. These are the movable, primarily the movable feasts. So the events whose dates change, most notably Easter, right? The date of Easter is different every year. It's calculated based on a combination of the lunar cycle and the solar year, and also the 7-day week. So that moves, and there are a lot of other feasts that move in conjunction with Easter. But this temporale, that's the Latin name, it's sometimes called the proper of time in English. It also contains the major feasts associated with Christ. So the non-movable ones like Christmas. So those are in the temporale. And so it starts here with the first Sunday of Advent. And you can see that it actually says it. This is a little bit worn, but in the rubric here, prima de adventu introitus. So this is the introit. That's the first reading in the Mass. And this is all done by one scribe in a textualis, of Gothic script. It's a sort of rotunda variant, which is a Southern European, Italian, and sometimes Spanish variant of Gothic script that has O's, the bowl. I mean, the main way to recognize this variant of Gothic script is that the bowls of the O's are quite wide, which is why it's called rotunda. It's a kind of rounded Gothic script that's very much characteristic of 14th and 15th century Italian books, especially liturgical books like this. So we have an A, a nice initial A here. And the scribe has varied the size of the script for the various sections. So this is the introit that is in the smaller letters. And then we have like the other parts, like the responsories, prayers, readings, secret. These are all parts of the Mass, right? The post-communion, those are all written in the larger script. But then other sections, like here, you see it goes from the larger script. This is called the tract. It's another reading. These are all required portions of the ceremony of the Mass, right? It's in smaller script. And then it goes back to the larger script for the reading here from the Gospel of Luke. And the offertory here is back to the small script. So there's just this variation, which is relatively standard in the size of the script. A few sort of codicological features. I mean, this is made in regular quires. Something here has been scraped off. Maybe an ownership mark, maybe the name of a priest or perhaps an institution that might have owned this book. We have catchwords here with these 4 little flourishes, right? So this is folio 8 verso. So that's the first quire, a quire of 4 bifolios. This is the center of the quire here. Pretty sorry. This is the center of the quire. You can just about see sewing cord in the center here. You'll have to maybe take my word for it, but it's there. So this is the end of the first choir, and the catchword tells us what's beginning on the next choir, and so on and so forth. It's interesting that I often tell my students that, flaws in parchment, like holes made in the production, animal bite in the skin that has been stretched out in the preparation of the parchment, are often not found in liturgical books, because this is a book for the celebration of the Mass. It's important to have a kind of dignified and very nice book, but this is a kind of exception to that rule, because you see a circular hole. So that's a flaw in the parchment that is written around very kind of matter-of-factly by the scribe. The rule that flawed parchment is usually not used in liturgical books is not the case here. This is a fairly modest book nonetheless, so maybe there was a little bit of a cost-cutting measure, right? Otherwise, you would discard or this bifolio or use it for another project. So this first section, the Temporale, is actually the first half of the temple. So it's the first half of these movable feasts of this proper of time, and it goes to Palm Sunday. And I'll skip to that. This missal has no illuminations. It has one illustration that I'll show you. It has no illuminations. Missals, fancy ones, can have historiated initials, and in fact, the missal that I mentioned earlier, the grander one that we sort of also acquired, we acquired these two so that they could sort of be a counterpoint to each other. MS Codex 2076 has about 40 illuminated initials, that have little figures and sometimes scenes in them, so that they could have more lavish programs of illustration. The other thing about missals is that they're relatively rare, especially kind of more workaday missals like this one, because they would just get used, and then in the 16th and 17th centuries, they really started printing them quite commonly, and there were changes introduced to the Mass and like the Counter-Reformation, and so some missals kind of were outdated and just discarded, or heavily used and discarded, and recycled for other purposes. The parchment perhaps recycled for other purposes. So the Temporale then continues until here, folio 59. And these are prefaces. So these are sort of chants to be sung for certain masses. These are called communicantes. So before consecration of bread and wine, for example, and at certain times of the year. And so these come after the first half of that Temporale. So the thing to understand is how the missal would have to be, different sections would have to be flipped to, depending on the time of year and the particular Mass being performed. And then these end. And so again, apart from that, we're sort of halfway through the Temporale at Palm Sunday, right? So again, these are the movable feasts mainly. This section ends with Palm Sunday. And the reason it ends with Palm Sunday is because we get to the center of the missal here. And this is often the most spectacular part, because it often has a miniature of the crucifixion. And this is now a sort of intermezzo in the missal. This is the canon of the Mass. So these are the texts that are in every Mass that the celebrant, the priest, has to say at every Mass throughout the year. So this section is off when the missal has been used a lot. It's often quite worn, as it is here. And so you would read whatever readings from the Temporale, either if it's before Easter in the first half or after Easter in the second half, but you would always come to this in the Mass and read it through. And again, the rubrications are simply to tell the priest, remind the priest what the different sections are. They're not read out loud. It's not like a modern Bible. The Bibles are sometimes printed today with red text, like the words that Jesus said. That's not what this is. This is not to be read out loud, and the black text is to be read out loud. And most priests would have this memorized because this has to be said every day, potentially multiple times a day. But what's really interesting here, of course, and the kind of most interesting feature of this book is this crucifixion miniature. One of the things that makes it interesting is that it's not original to the book. It's probably added. The folio is a different texture of parchment, slightly smaller, and it is heavily worn, and it's a style that is more sort of Alpine, Northern European, and sometimes these images wore out because they had to be kissed by the priest during the Mass. And this one you can see is quite worn. And some fancy missals, in order to eliminate or minimize the damage done to the image, had a sort of extra little cross that the priest would kiss instead of kissing the image. And this is a very gory, very bloody image of the crucifixion. This relates to a sort of trend in visualizing the Passion of Christ in the later Middle Ages, especially in sort of Central Europe. The pigment is all done in minium or red lead, very characteristic orange-red pigment. For those who know about pigments, this is lead oxide, so it's very toxic. And so the idea that a priest kissed this for the Mass as part of the ceremony is sort of alarming. And also, it's just interesting that the book is probably perhaps Central Italian, and this is maybe made in the German-speaking world or in the Alpine world. So this is an object that's traveled and had this page added, perhaps to replace a worn-out original image. Many missals have had these, sometimes it's 2 pages of illumination. Many have had these removed because they're usually the most impressive image, and they were often collected as works of art. So we go through the Canon of the Mass, and then it's quite short. And in fact, it's so short that sometimes the Canon of the Mass was written on a card, a kind of big card in a frame called an altar card, which meant that the priest could read that directly and not have to read it from the Missal. Someone has mentioned these crosses. Yes, those are that's an indication that the priest has to do the sign of the cross at those junctures. So that's what the red X is. So this is where the Eucharist is consecrated. These are the prayers for consecration. And then we resume the Temporale, beginning with Easter Sunday. So the idea is that the Canon of the Mass, and you can see how thumbed this section is because it's used every day compared to the other sections, right? So it's very worn, the canon portion. And then the Temporale continues at Easter. So the idea is you're kind of commemorating Easter every day through the Mass, but then here you have the specific readings that continue. And I'll skip through these all the way to 138 verso. So you can see that this Temporale takes up most of the book. There are also these finding tabs, which it's hard to put a date on. It's hard to know if they're original to the manuscript or not. But they correspond to these major sections, which is kind of normal. These are this is sort of fabric, maybe silk, that's pierced through to make these finding tabs, and there are others as well. And here we have the beginning of the sort of next section, which is the Sanctorale. So these are the fixed feast days for saints, for specific saints first. And this is called the Proper of Saints in English. And it starts almost always with St. Andrew, whose feast day is November 30th. So this is right before the beginning of Advent, or basically marks the beginning of Advent, as the Temporale did at the beginning. So there's this kind of corresponding section of the fixed feast days, like the saints' days, which are always on the same day, like Valentine's Day or St. Patrick's Day. And different missals will have different saints. Some have more that are commemorated, some have fewer. This one has relatively few, so just the kind of major saints. And then this section is usually followed by another section. You can see it starts, this section ends, another one starts with this penwork initial. And this is called the Common of Saints, the Communale. These are readings for masses of a certain class of saints, so not for a specific saint. So these are to be read whenever, for example, you're commemorating an apostle, a single apostle, several apostles, one pope martyr, one non-pope martyr, several martyrs, a confessor who's a saint who's not martyred, several, etc. And so these are sort of these can be used multiple times during the year, as opposed to the specific portions for specific masses for specific saints. And then this is not very long in this missal. We're getting towards the end. We only have a few minutes left in our session, so this is good. This ends on folio 177. And then you have some additional masses, a general mass for the dead, votive masses, which are masses that can be said on weekdays outside of feast days throughout the year. And then there are sort of other shorter texts to be pronounced, with for burial rites after a mass for the dead, and for blessing waters, for baptisms and things like that. So you have sort of these sort of accessory masses or accessory readings for things other than masses as well. And that's sort of typical also in a missal. And there we go. And then it ends. And there's a canceled, what would have been a blank folio. Maybe somebody removed it to reuse that piece of parchment because nothing was written on it. Maybe it was done originally. But in any case, that's our Missale Multae Antiquitatis, the very old missal from around the year 1400, MS Codex 2053. And I'll turn once more, if I can find it, to the canon of the Mass with the crucifixion image, just because that's the sort of, in terms of visually and sort of historically, because it was added, the most interesting part of the book. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Amy, for posting those links to next week's talk, which will also be a guest, or my colleague Lynn Ransom, who will be presenting a spectacular new acquisition, a 14th century copy of a genealogy of Christ and a set of incredible theological diagrams. So we're deep into theology this month at SIM. So thank you for joining us, and see you next time.